The stars are brightly shining. It is the night of our dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till He appeared and the soul felt its worth. A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Fall on your knees. Oh, hear the angel voices. Oh, night divine, oh, night when Christ was born. Truly He taught us to love one another. His law is love, and His gospel is peace. Chains shall He break, for the slave is our brother, and in His name all oppression shall cease. Sweet hymn
I just love that song. And I used to love singing that song every Christmas until I couldn't hit the high note at the end anymore. You know, that song just screams Christmas to me. And so do all the other ones here at this time of year, like "O Come All Ye Faithful" and "Joy to the World" and that "Angels We Have Heard on High." But you know, sometimes the sights, the sounds, the smells of the Christmas season, they seem a little more like wrapping paper to me. The songs, the decorations, the lights, the trees, the parties, the activities, the traditions, the food, the gifts, they temporarily dress things up, and they make our lives feel pretty, and they make us feel pretty good. But wrapping paper doesn't last, does it? Unless you're some sort of an obsessive saver, or wrapping paper is pretty quickly ripped off the box and thrown into the recycling. And no matter how pretty the wrapping paper is, it doesn't change what's in the box, does it? And that can be a problem. You see, for many people, the Christmas season wrapping paper this year is just covering up a cruddy year, or a cruddy 2 years, or a cruddy life. One where stress is really easy to find, but hope's missing in action. Can you relate? Well, I remember last Christmas and thinking that life was going to get better. I mean, it just had to get better, right? And there were some signs of hope. We were back to worshiping in person. Christmas services were out on our plaza, and while that was different, you know, it was pretty out there, looking at the mountains, and we were able to worship with a whole lot more people outside than we would have been under the indoor restrictions at the time, and it was actually pretty neat. And vaccines were being developed at a record pace. I myself chalked that up to the prayers that God would intervene and would bless the scientists with minds that would be able to figure those things out. There was hope that pretty soon the shots would become widely available and we could knock this COVID thing out and get back to life as normal. The reality? Well, that hope was short-lived, wasn't it? What actually happened is those hopes were more like wrapping paper. COVID wasn't knocked out, it's still around. One variant, one wave after another just keeps coming and coming and coming. Kids are back in school, right? But ask any teacher, the classroom's far from normal, and behavior is, well, to put it nicely, challenging. Society is not much more civil than it was. In both churches and businesses, we're still having to learn how to adapt to this new reality. Economy-wise, inflation's taken off and things just keep costing more and more and more. Marriages are struggling. They're breaking. Relationships are strained and struggling as well. People are so weary and worn out that a lot of people don't seem to have the energy to do much more than just make it through the day. And as for loneliness, well, I read an academic study recently that said that 31% of people, that's almost a third of people, felt lonely at some point every day. And actually 45% of those, that's almost half, described those feelings of loneliness as intense or as unbearable. I mean, can you relate? And can you relate to the feeling that even all the Christmas stuff that covers it up can't really cover it up this year? That no matter how festive you try to be, you still are going to end up feeling more empty and exhausted than anything else? If so, then maybe, like me, you're not even trying on that Christmas season thing. I mean, there's still a possibility that I might get decorations up, but as of this taping, there's no tree, and there are no decorations up in the Schmidt household. And you know what? There might not be. I mean, this year there's no real interest in them. There's no real energy for them, and this year there's not really even much energy to think about making decisions about that kind of stuff. So as for now, all that's up in our household is the nativity set. And you know what? That's it. And that might be it. We're tired. It's been a long 2 years. And what we need this Christmas is hope for Christmas. I'm thinking maybe you need that too. And that maybe that's why you tuned in to this message. Perhaps you need hope as much as I do. Maybe even more. And if you do, I've got good news for you. That hope is here, not in the stuff of the season, but in the person of Jesus Christ. Luke chapter 2, verse 11. For to you is born this day a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. John chapter 1, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. What that tells me is that while the Christmas season stuff might be wrapping paper, Jesus isn't. Jesus is the real thing. Real hope wrapped up in a baby and laid in a manger. And maybe that's why, even if we don't put anything else up, we still put up our nativity scene. Because that nativity scene reminds us, even though we didn't have much energy for anything else, it reminds us where true hope is found, even when everything else seems kind of dark. I think you'll see that too, as we get into Jesus' story. You know, as you watch that video, those nativity figures look all neat and clean, don't they? But here's what I actually see when I look at the text of the story. I see, number one, that God does vulnerable. Right? Think about this. He came to earth as a baby who had to depend on his parents for everything. The one who holds the universe in his hands made himself small enough to be held. Small enough to be held by others and helped and diapered and burped and fed and clothed and everything else that every other human baby goes through. The one who everybody looks to for help made himself helpless. God does vulnerable. I also see, number two, that God does messy. I mean, if you look at the text of the story in Luke chapter 2, where was Jesus born? In a barn. Well, actually, more likely in a sheltered place behind the inn that was a lot more open to the elements than closed in and protected. A place where they just kind of kept the animals who were not lowing, as the song says. They were making all the normal animal noises and sounds, which were neither quiet nor musical. And the place probably smelled. I mean, the animals didn't go outside to do their business. And speaking of poop, I mean, baby Jesus, messed his diapers a lot, because that's what babies do. And he was probably crying a lot, because there's a lot of crying with babies too. They cry all the time. And Jesus' resting place, it wasn't a nice plush mattress. It was probably some straw or feed roughly thrown on a little rock shelf. Yeah, God does messy, doesn't he? And you look a little deeper and you see that God also does loneliness. I mean, there was no room for them in the inn, was there? All you've got here is Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus, no extended family, nobody else looking in, well, except for those shepherds who came and then they left again. But shepherds didn't count for much with anybody anyway. They were more tolerated than appreciated. Yep, God does loneliness. And I also see, number 4, that God does dark. God does darkness. I mean, there's no electric lights in Bethlehem. So after the sun went down, after dark, it was just, well, dark. Right? Really dark. And probably cold as well out there on that long, cold, dark night with the animals. Imagine giving birth to a baby in those conditions. That was probably a long, dark night for Mary and Joseph. God does darkness. I mean, just think about that. Vulnerable, messy, lonely, dark. That was Jesus' first Christmas experience, which means that right from the time that he showed up, Jesus lived your world. Not just saw your world, actually lived your world. And for Jesus, this wasn't a short-term experience. It wasn't a single night or a single season. If you read the record that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John wrote of the things that Jesus said and did, you're going to find lots of events in Jesus' life where he was vulnerable and that were messy and lonely and dark, culminating on a hill outside Jerusalem where they put Jesus on a cross. I mean, vulnerable? How much more vulnerable does it get than being falsely accused and tried and convicted and then paraded, marched through the streets to your execution site, and then hung there, hanging naked on a cross, literally exposed to all the world? Not much more vulnerable than that. And messy? I mean, how much messier does it get than being whipped and beaten until you're almost dead? Your body bruised and broken and a bloody mess? Blood either pouring down or blood being caked on? Nailed to a cross and then hanging there and bleeding and dying, and your face, your body almost unrecognizable? Messy. And lonely? Well, how much lonelier does it get than being betrayed by one friend, denied by another, abandoned by all? And then, as you turn on the cross to look at the Father, the Father turns his face away. My God, why have you forsaken me? Yeah? God does lonely. And he also does dark. I mean, how much darker can it get than 3 hours of complete darkness in what was a cloudless sky right in the middle of the day from noon to 3? And then dying. And after dying, being laid in a borrowed tomb with a stone rolled across the entrance and sealed shut so no light could get in or out. I mean, vulnerable, messy, lonely, dark. Jesus experienced all of that. And on that Friday, it seemed to every observer as if finally even Jesus had finally been overcome by all that. Wrong. John chapter 1, verse 5 again. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You see, after Friday came Sunday. And on Easter, God once again spoke out of the darkness and said, "Let there be light." And the stone was rolled away, and Jesus walked out alive. Alive and well, and powerful, not vulnerable, clean, not a mess, appearing to his friends, not hiding and hanging out all by himself, and shining, not stuck in the darkness, overcoming everything, even death, overcoming the vulnerability, the messiness, the loneliness, the darkness that he was born into, and that he willingly walked into on a cross. And in so doing, Jesus gives us hope. He gives us hope for this Christmas and for everyone after this, that we can do the same. Hope, not because we're so special, but because he is. You see, Jesus understands your world, and Jesus knows how hard your life is sometimes because he lived it, remember? Right from the very beginning. And what we see in that is that Jesus is with you in every situation, even the cruddy ones and the messy ones. And Jesus is for you in every situation, even the ones where you feel most vulnerable. And Jesus can help you through any situation, even the ones where you feel like the darkness is closing in and that the darkness might be all that there is. See, not only does Jesus understand, Jesus overcomes. Jesus overcomes. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness couldn't overcome it. And the darkness doesn't understand why it couldn't win. Well, it didn't win because it couldn't. It couldn't because God is stronger than all this stuff. And see, it's when we see that we start to have real hope. When we start to change our perspective. And we start to see, instead of seeing endless darkness around us, we start to be able to see in the darkness that pinpoint of light. That's Jesus Christ, the light of the world. Jesus Christ, the light in a God who chose to come to the dark from the very beginning, who on that first Christmas night so long ago chose vulnerability and messiness and loneliness and darkness so that we could have light and so that we could find hope. And then in finding hope, we could even have a little spark of joy in our lives. Real hope, real joy that lasts longer than the wrapping paper does. Because that's the message of Christmas. So what do you do with that? Well, if you haven't yet invited Jesus into your heart, will you do it? Will you consider it? Will you do it right now? And if Jesus is in your heart, if you haven't invited him into your heart, then will you take the next steps in the relationship? You read the rest of the story in Luke chapter 2 and you see three things. The shepherds, well, they worshiped God. Continually, they were worshiping God. Second thing they did is they told others about Jesus. They couldn't stop telling what they'd seen and heard. And then there's Mary, who saw all these things, and she kept thinking about them, turning them over in her mind and in her heart, thinking about what the events of this Christmas meant for her and for everybody else. And if my suggestion here is if you want to hold on to that hope, if you want to hold on to that hope and find a spark of joy that lasts a little longer than that wrapping paper, well, that you take those same steps.